The prairie sun stretched across the wide horizon, painting the field of golden wheat with its last rays as the village bells rang faintly in the distance, calling workers back from the farmlands. But in the modest home on the edge of town, a young woman named Clara sat by the window, her hands clasped tightly, her heart heavy with disappointment that had become all too familiar. She was 22, a fair age for marriage in her small frontier community. Yet she had already been rejected by more suitors than she could count. Men who had come with flowers or promises only to leave with excuses about her not being enough, some whispering she was too plain, others muttering she was too stubborn, and still others blaming her for her father's debts that clung to the family like chains. And Clara, though strong in spirit, for she dreamed of love, of building a home, of raising children on land where she and a husband could grow something lasting together. But every knock on the door had ended with her mother's sigh and her father's silence, until the townsfolk began to speak of her as the girl no man wanted, a cruel label that followed her at Sunday service, at the market, even at barn dances where other girls were whisked away into the arms of eager young men while she stood alone at the edge of the floor, pretending the music didn't sting her heart. That autumn night, as the cool wind rattled the shutters, her mother tried to comfort her with gentle words, but Clara could see the truth in her mother's eyes, the worry that her daughter might never find a place in a world that seemed determined to close its doors. And Clara, though determined not to weep, felt tears sting as she whispered a prayer to the heavens, asking for just one chance, just one man who would see her not as a burden, not as a failure, but as a woman capable of loving with all she had to give. Across town, meanwhile, a cowboy named James rode back into the settlement after months on the trail, his horse weary, his clothes dust-worn, his eyes carrying the loneliness of endless nights beneath the stars, with no one waiting for him at dawn. For James was not the kind of man women chased at dances either. He was hardworking, quiet, and scarred by a childhood of loss that had left him distrustful of promises. But in his heart he longed for more than the cattle drives and gun smoke. He longed for a family, though he did not believe such a thing could be waiting for him, not when so many saw him as rough, poor, and undeserving. Fate, however, had its own plans, and it was on a gray morning at the town square that James first saw Clara, standing by the bakery with her basket, her hair loose from the wind, her face caught in a moment of sadness that pulled at something inside him. And though he had never been one for boldness, he found himself watching her longer than he should have, until Clara noticed his gaze and quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing, for she had grown used to men staring at her with judgment, not interest, and she could not imagine that this quiet cowboy, with kind yet tired eyes, might be seeing something in her no one else had. Later that week, their paths crossed again when Clara's basket slipped on the uneven cobblestone and spilled apples across the dirt, and James, without hesitation, knelt to help gather them, his large calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he picked up the fruit and placed it back into her basket. And for the first time Clara looked at him directly, noticing the sincerity in his face, the lack of mockery, the quiet strength in the way he held himself. And though neither spoke more than a few words, something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of recognition. Days turned into weeks, and though gossip continued to circle Clara, some saying she was cursed, others that she would end up a spinster, James found himself walking the long path past her father's farm whenever he returned from work, hoping for a glimpse of her tending the garden or carrying laundry to dry. And slowly, carefully, he began to offer small kindnesses, fixing a broken gate hinge, carrying a sack of flour from the market, his actions speaking what his tongue still stumbled to say. And Clara, though cautious, began to feel a warmth grow inside her, a fragile hope she feared to name but could not ignore. One evening, as autumn leaves swirled around them, James finally spoke from his heart, his words plain but strong, telling Clara he was not a man of riches or fine promises, but he could offer her honesty, hard work, and a love that would not falter. And Clara, trembling yet resolute, felt tears rise as she realized that this was the answer to her prayer, not a perfect suitor with polished boots and empty compliments, but a cowboy who saw her not as unwanted but as cherished. not as flawed but as enough. Still, her father bristled at the thought of his daughter marrying a man with so little land, so little wealth, and the townsfolk scoffed when whispers spread that Clara might finally have a proposal. But Clara, for once, did not let their voices sway her, for she knew in her bones that James was different, that he was the one man who would not cast her aside when storms came. And so, with the resolve of someone who had known too much rejection, she chose to say yes, yes to the cowboy who had seen her heart, yes to the chance of a future built not on what others thought but on what they could create together. As the first snow fell over the small town, Clara and James stood quietly in the small chapel, hands clasped, their vows simple but unbreakable. And though the pews were not filled with cheering neighbors, though the air lacked grand celebration, the warmth between them glowed brighter than any fire. And in that moment, Clara knew she had found her place. And as they stepped out into the cold winter evening, James pulled her close, whispering that their story was only beginning, that no matter what hardships lay ahead, they would face them side by side. And Clara, smiling through tears, believed him with all her heart. The early days of marriage were far from easy for Clara and James, for though their vows had been spoken with love, reality soon reminded them that love alone could not fill empty cupboards or mend broken fences. And Clara, who had once spent her days beneath the protection of her father's modest farm, churn butter, mend torn clothes, and ride long miles into town for supplies, her hands blistering, her body weary, but her heart strangely full. For every hardship was shared, every small triumph celebrated together, and in that simple unity she felt richer than she had ever imagined. Yet still, the whispers of the town carried on, neighbors remarking that Clara had settled for a poor cowboy, others muttering that James could have found a stronger bride. And though their words stung, Clara learned to meet them with a quiet dignity, reminding herself that true strength was not measured by gossip but by the way people held each other up when the world tried to push them down. James, for his part, worked tirelessly, taking extra shifts driving cattle, repairing barns, and breaking horses for other ranchers, all while tending to their small plot of land. And though the work left him bone-tired, he always returned home with a gentleness reserved only for Clara, his eyes softening when he saw her waiting on the porch, a lantern glowing beside her. The sight of her steady presence, enough to chase away the loneliness that had haunted him for years. Slowly, as seasons turned, Clara discovered a resilience in herself. She had never known her back grew, stronger from carrying loads of wood, her fingers deft from sewing and cooking, her voice steady when James faltered under the weight of debts and drought sand. In those moments she realized that love was not the flutter of a dance or the sweetness of fleeting courtship, sacrifice by sacrifice, and in that labor she found a purpose that silenced the cruel voices of rejection from her past. One crisp spring morning, Clara woke to a strange flutter within her body, a delicate stirring that filled her with both fear and wonder. And when the midwife confirmed what her heart already suspected, that she was with child, Clara wept in James's arms, not from fear but from gratitude, for this child would be the living proof of their love, the seed of hope planted in soil others had once called barren. And James, though a man of few words, kissed her forehead and whispered that whatever it took, he would provide, he would protect, he would make sure their child never felt unwanted as they once had. The months that followed were some of the hardest yet, with Clara's body heavy with pregnancy and James battling both poor harvests and a drought that left the land cracked and weary. Yet even in their struggle they found moments of quiet joy. James carving a small wooden cradle by the firelight, Clara sewing tiny clothes with trembling fingers, both of them dreaming of the child who would soon fill their small home with cries and laughter. On a stormy night in late summer, after hours of labor that left Clara gasping, drenched in sweat, and gripping James's hand with a strength he had never known she possessed, a daughter was born, her first cries piercing the thunder outside. And when James placed the small, wriggling bundle into Clara's arms, both of them wept openly, their tears mingling with the rain that pounded on the roof. For in that fragile new life, they saw not only a future but a redemption from all the pain and rejection of the past. They named her Grace, for she was the gift neither had, believed they deserved, yet had been blessed with nonetheless. And from the moment her tiny fingers curled around James's thumb, the cowboy who had once thought himself unworthy knew he had been given the greatest purpose of all, to be a father, to raise his daughter with the love and protection he himself had been denied as a child. The days ahead were filled with sleepless nights, endless chores, and the unrelenting demands of a newborn. But in every cry, every first smile, every soft coo, Clara felt a joy that far outweighed the exhaustion, and she often rocked Grace in the cradle James had built, whispering stories of how unwanted she herself had once felt, how every suitor had turned away, only for God to place in her path the one man who would say yes, the one man who would give her not just a home but a family. James, too, found his heart reshaped by fatherhood, his rough hands becoming tender as he held Grace close, his stern voice turning soft when he sang her to sleep in the evenings after long days of toil. And though the ranch remained modest, though money was still tight, their home was filled with something richer than gold: laughter, love, and the unspoken bond of three souls tied together by fate. Still, challenges lingered, for debts had not disappeared. Storms continued to threaten their crops, and the outside world often judged them harshly. But Clara and James had learned by then that true strength was not in avoiding hardship, but in facing it side by side. And with Grace's bright eyes watching them, they found themselves braver, more determined, unwilling to let despair ever again steal what they had fought so hard to build. And so, as the sun set over their humble ranch, Clara sat on the porch with her daughter in her arms, James at her side, and for the first time in years, she felt not the sting of rejection but the deep, abiding peace of belonging, knowing that though the world had once cast her aside, she had found the love and purpose she had always longed for in the heart of a cowboy and in the life of a child. They both adored Dot as the years rolled on. Clara and James found themselves tested in ways neither could have imagined, for though their love had given them strength and their daughter, Grace had brought them immeasurable joy. The world outside their little ranch was not always kind, and with each passing season came new trials that demanded every ounce of their courage. Grace grew quickly, her laughter echoing across the fields, her small feet running through the tall grass as if she belonged to the land itself. And Clara often watched her with a heart so full it ached, remembering the days when she had been told she would never be chosen, never be loved, never be a mother. And now here she was, chasing after a bright-eyed child who was the living proof of her worth. James, though hardened by the demands of ranch work, had softened into a father who never let a day pass without showing his daughter affection, lifting her onto his shoulders as he rode out to mend fences, teaching her how to hold the reins of a horse, and tucking her in at night with stories of courage and kindness. For he wanted her to know that though the world could be cruel, it could also be beautiful if faced with love. Yet behind their happiness, shadows loomed, for droughts returned, leaving their cattle lean and their fields parched. Debts piled high as banks demanded payment they could barely scrape together, and whispers in town continued to paint Clara as a woman who had once been rejected and James as the cowboy who had settled for less. But instead of letting the bitterness poison them, they leaned into each other, using every cruel word as fuel to build a stronger bond, determined to prove not with arguments but with their lives that love chosen freely and fiercely was the greatest wealth of all. Grace, too young to understand the weight her parents carried, often became their anchor without even knowing it. Her innocent questions, "Mama, why do people look at us that way?" Or "Papa, why do we have less than the others?" reminding Clara and James that their duty was not to explain away cruelty but to show their daughter that dignity was found, not in riches but in resilience. One winter, when sickness swept through the town, Clara fell gravely ill, her body weakened by fever, and James nearly broke under the fear of losing her, staying up nights by her side, cooling her brow with wet cloths, whispering prayers he had long forgotten how to speak. And in those hours he realized just how deeply she had become the center of his existence, how unbearable the thought of raising Grace without her was. And when at last she recovered, pale and frail but alive, he vowed never again to take even a single moment with her for granted. Clara, shaken by how close death had come, found herself clinging even tighter to the life they had built, holding Grace longer in her arms, watching James with a tenderness that only near loss could create. And she began to write in a small journal each night, recording her gratitude for the simple things: the sound of Grace's laughter, the warmth of James's hand, the peace of watching a sunrise from their porch, because she knew now that happiness was not in the grand victories, but in the fragile, fleeting details that might otherwise be overlooked. As Grace grew into a bright young girl, townsfolk began to notice how different she was, how confident and kind despite her family's modest life. And though some continued to whisper about her mother's past and her father's poverty, others began to admire the way the little family carried themselves with quiet dignity, their love too steady to be shaken by petty gossip. James, though still haunted by the weight of bills and the constant grind of survival, found renewed strength in teaching his daughter lessons not found in books: how to treat every creature with respect, how to stand tall when others tried to push you down, how to find beauty in the horizon even when storms threatened. And Grace soaked up his wisdom like sunlight, her small face lighting up whenever he praised her. Clara, watching her daughter blossom, often reflected on the irony that the very men who had once rejected her would now look at her family with envy, seeing a joy they could never buy with wealth. And she would smile to herself, not with bitterness but with quiet triumph, for she knew she had been blessed not despite her rejection, but because of it, for it had led her to the one man whose love was real. Yet still, trouble was never far, for one evening, as the family gathered at church, a group of townsfolk began to murmur cruelly within earshot, and though James's fists clenched, ready to defend his wife's honor, Clara placed a gentle hand on his arm and whispered, "We don't need to fight them, James, we've already won by the life we live." And those words struck him so deeply that he carried them with him long after, realizing that true strength was not in brawls or loud declarations, but in living with a love so undeniable it silenced lies on its own. That night, as Grace slept between them, James whispered into the darkness that no matter how hard the road grew, no matter how many storms battered them, he would never let go of Clara's hand. And she, half asleep, squeezed his fingers back, both of them knowing that the greatest wealth they had was lying right there in the quiet of their small, humble home. As the seasons shifted once more and the golden wheat fields bowed low under the summer sun, Clara and Samuel found themselves stepping into a new chapter of life that neither had fully anticipated, but both had secretly longed for. Their daughter, little Hope, had grown into a curious toddler with golden curls that glistened like sunlight and a laugh that rang out across the ranch like music sent from heaven itself. She had become the very heart of their household, and wherever she toddled, joy seemed to follow. Samuel would often return from long days in the saddle, his boots heavy with dust and his hands rough from work, only to be met with Hope's outstretched arms and Clara's warm, knowing smile. The once lonely widower had found that his house was no longer silent and cold but alive, with the laughter of a child and the tenderness of a woman who had brought him back to life. Yet even in the glow of newfound love, shadows sometimes crept at the edge of their peace. Clara, despite her joy, often caught herself wondering why Samuel had chosen her when so many others had turned her away. She would lie awake at night, watching the soft rise and fall of her daughter's chest in the cradle by their bed, and the steady rhythm of Samuel's breath beside her, still battling a quiet fear that perhaps she was not enough. He pulled Clara into his arms on the porch. The scent of rain lingered in the air as the horizon darkened with rolling clouds. "Do you know why I said yes when no one else would?" She blinked, caught off guard, her heart beating fast in her chest. "Because I knew from the start," Samuel continued, "that you weren't meant to be rejected, you were meant to be mine. God brought you here, not just for me, but for this family, for this land, for our little girl. And I'd say yes 1,000 times more." His words sank into her heart like a healing balm, easing years of doubt and loneliness. Clara realized she had finally found what she had prayed for all her life: a place to belong.